I'm going to talk a bit, about the Youth Employment Challenge, so-called. The first question I suppose to ask is what do we mean by the challenge? What is the challenge? And or in the terms of this morning's keynote, what is exclusion from what? And from an ILO perspective, we're talking about exclusion from decent work. That is not just employment, but employment which is productive, freely chosen, and in some real sense gainful for young people. That's a kind of approach. I'm going to talk mostly about, although the title is Rising to the Youth Employment Challenge, I'm actually going to talk more about the nature of the challenge. And in particular, I'm going to discuss the findings or summarise some of the findings of two recent major ILO publications on youth employment, global employment trends for youth, and the Rising to Youth Employment Challenge. I brought a few copies along with me, but I think they may already have gone. But they're freely available on the net, should anybody be interested to follow up on this. The first of these, Global Employment Trends for Youth, this is a biannual publication produced every 2 years, and it charts trends in the major youth labour market indicators, but also goes into some issues in more detail, and we looked this time at sectoral change and the implications more generally of demographic and technological change for youth labour markets. The other publication is more analytical and looks at a number of policy issues related to youth employment, in particular things like contractual forms, internship, this kind of contractual forms for youth these days, informality and this kind of problem. Okay, so I'm just going to briefly run over some of the main findings of these. The number that, when we launched this report, the Global Employment Trends for Youth, the number that everybody hangs onto is the youth unemployment rate. The youth unemployment rate at a global level is actually rather stable and has been for some time. It's sort of fluctuating between 12 and 13%, but it hasn't really changed very much. What that hides is a lot of regional variation and country variation. Actually, the numbers of young unemployed has fallen quite a lot in recent years, last decade or so, but that's largely to do with the shrinking youth labour market, which has to do with demographic change, but also greater participation of young people in education. Anyway, just to give you a brief, I don't know how easy it is, I can hardly see these numbers here from, I guess that reflects my age, but there's quite a lot of variety in youth unemployment rates across regions. In particular, it's particularly high in Northern Africa and the Arab states. However, more and more we're looking not so much at youth unemployment rates per se as more towards so-called NEET rates, that is the proportion of young people who are not in employment or education and training. That is all those young people who are not engaged either in work or in some form of learning. And that, I think, is perhaps a more useful, or certainly a useful complementary indicator, and it's been chosen as the SDG indicator for the state of youth labour markets. That is quite high at a global level, and it's particularly high in emerging economies. That is what we call or sometimes known as middle-income countries. What is most notable about that is the extreme overrepresentation of women in that. 3/4 of NEETs are women. So broadly speaking, globally, the NEET rate for young men is a little under 10%. The NEET rate for young women is something like 33-34%. It's about 1/3 of young women are not in education or training globally, and they're particularly concentrated, as I say, in emerging middle-income countries. I guess because in developing low-income countries, almost everybody, or there's much more pressure to participate in some form of gainful work. One simply cannot be outside the labour market completely. Of major concern also is the quality of work. First of all, working poverty. The ILO defines working poverty as those working earning less than, extreme and moderate poverty. Moderate moderate poverty being those earning less than $3.10 a day, one can see the working poverty amongst young people is much higher than adults, and it's really quite high. 40%, nearly 40% of young people are working, but they remain in poverty. And if we look at Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, that figure reaches almost 70%. So an awful lot of young people are in employment, but they don't earn nearly enough to feed themselves. Again, for all these statistics, young people are more affected than so-called adults being those over 25. The African statistics are of particular concern because although globally the global youth labour force is falling, as they both because of demographic shifts but also because of increasing participation in education. In Africa, that orange bar in the middle there, you can see is rising rapidly. So in Africa, we have very high working poverty and also a prospect of a rapidly increasing youth labour market in the future. And that is an issue of some concern. Another aspect of work quality is informal employment. I must say I was a bit astonished when I first started looking at this, and in developing countries, almost the entire youth labour force, those in work, are in informal employment. 19 out of 20 young people in work are in informal employment in low-income countries. That, to me, seems extraordinary. And it's still very high in emerging economies. For both groups, again, young people are predominantly affected, much more so than adults. And moreover, we dug into this a little bit more in the Rising to Youth Employment Challenge, but we looked a bit more carefully at this. And what one finds, we chart in this figure, shows the informality rates, if you like, of young people by education level. Going from the top of the figure, which shows the lowest education level, down to the purple figure at the bottom, which shows those with tertiary education. The point here being that for those with tertiary education, engagement in formal employment falls off with age. So the implication is that informality is a transient state, or more transient state, for those with higher levels of education. Informality is not the same for everybody. Whereas those with low levels of education, it's a permanent state. Those entering informal employment at a young age with very low levels of education get stuck there, and they stay there. So informality is not the same for all, and it affects. It's a practically permanent state for the low educated. And it is, why do we care? Well, it's extremely deleterious to young people. Perhaps the easiest way to see this is look at the wage gap, that is the earnings of young people in informal employment, controlling for various other factors. What this figure shows is that, again, the informal wage gap, just like the permanence in informality, is largest for those at the bottom end, those with lowest levels of education. It is also bigger for young women, particularly those with low levels of education. It's kind of hard to see from here, I guess, but that's what the figure shows. So what's going on in the labour market and employment more generally? Well, if we look regionally, in higher income countries, there's been a big expansion of the involvement of young people in health and care sectors. It seems to be the main expanding sector, as with, I suppose, accompanying aging populations in Europe and Northern America, whereas in Asia Pacific there's still substantial growth in traditional industrial sectors. Again, if you look at Africa, there's been some expansion in manufacturing and construction in the last decade or so, but it's very limited compared to the need. There are not nearly enough jobs being created in traditional industrial sectors in Africa. The other big bit of the story at least from my point of view, is the ILO talks about a thing called vulnerable employment. That is young and older workers, also those who are involved in own account work or as work as contributing family workers. These are considered as vulnerable workers. Vulnerable employment is falling, and it's falling particularly for young people. There's been a big, so it's fallen from about 45% in 2005 to about 30% in 2015. So the 20% increase in wage employment. That's a positive story in itself. However, if we look at the nature of the wage employment being created, the vast majority, most of this new wage employment is coming in emerging and developing countries, and most of that is accounted for either by temporary forms of formal employment or by the expansion of informal employment. So temporary employment, actually at a global level, has increased by 60% over the last decade or so. And in emerging and developing countries, it's more than doubled. At the same time, also informal wage employment has expanded. So this move from so-called vulnerable employment to wage employment has not seen any significant improvement in the conditions of working young people. They're moving from self-employment, own account employment and contributing family work into insecure, precarious forms of wage employment. So just to conclude, young people face a bunch of difficulties. The challenge for young people these days is extreme. It's huge. Need rates are high, but really I think the main area of concern is in job quality. This is both in high-income countries and low-income countries. The high-income countries, you've got a growth in precarious forms of formal employment, and in low-income countries, it's about informality, but also there is some growth also in these temporary employment forms in the formal sector. Working poverty is high. Informal employment is the norm for most young people in the world today. And the shift away from vulnerable employment has not necessarily meant a big improvement in job quality. The majority of new wage jobs, as I said, are temporary and formal. And there are a bunch of things that one can do. I think perhaps just to leave on one point, so it's important to look at the job quality now. And the second point, which also was raised this morning, I think there's more and more need to adopt coordinated strategies. We tend, as certainly in my organisation, but also I see in other organisations, similar organisations, we tend to put things in boxes, active labour market programmes or entrepreneurship programmes or macroeconomic policies or whatever, and they tend to be rather separate. But there's clearly need for recognition of complementarities in the interaction between these policies and dealing with youth employment programmes. So in general, we tend to take an approach favouring a coordinated approach to youth employment programmes, seen broadly at the national level. So I'll leave things there, I think.